Good morning, and again, thank you all for attending this seminar. And in this first conference, we first want to analyze what the Russia-Ukraine war tells us about the future of modern warfare. And this conflict, now well into its third year, and well, actually almost into its fourth year, has become a testing ground for the tools, tactics, and strategies that will shape how wars are fought in the future, in the decades ahead. It has shown that large-scale conventional combat can reappear in Europe. It seemed that maybe conventional warfare was over, but eventually this war is one of the factors that has shown that actually conventional warfare is here to reappear and to stay. While at the same time it has revealed how digital technologies, disinformation campaigns, drones, cyber operations now play a central role in the conduct of war. And actually, few people are better equipped to help us understand these developments than Professor Michael Betz of King's College London. Professor Betz's research explores how war is conducted in contemporary conflicts, including through the use of advanced technologies, control of information, strategic communication, cyber capabilities, and the civilian-military interaction. And these themes are at the heart of today's topics. In this lecture, Professor Betz will guide us through key lessons this war offers for modern warfare, and his perspective will help us see the conflict not only as a tragic event in Europe, but also as a turning point in understanding what future wars might look like. So thank you very much, Professor Betz, for being here with us today. We look forward to hearing your insights on this issue. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in such a grand room with such a smart-looking audience. Right, so implications for modern warfare of the Russo-Ukraine War, 2023 to somewhere. We're not quite sure where it's going to end. In 20 years, assuming it is ended then, I think that's a fair assumption. In 20 years, people in the West are going to look back on the Russo-Ukraine War a bit like previous generations looked back on the First World War. From the wreckage of their societies, which one hopes they will be rebuilding at that point, from whatever is left, they're going to ask certain questions. They're going to say, how did we let that happen? They're going to ask, why didn't we listen to the warnings? They might say, when George Kennan, who after all was the author of the Cold War containment strategy that arguably won the Cold War, ultimately, when George Kennan warned that the expansion of NATO was strategic folly of the highest order, why did our leaders laugh off his antique, retired opinion? When statesmen and commanders told us that victory was around the corner, that we had to stay the course, indeed that we had to sacrifice more, as the French Chief of General Staff announced yesterday or the day before, I recall, if I'm correct, saying that the French people need to understand that their sons also need to die. Why did we believe them? When television pundits told us that the Russian army was bleeding itself to death, that Ukraine was punishing them badly for every meter of ground gained, why didn't we ask, how do you know? Or better, who do you serve? The heart of the matter is this, in my opinion. Losing wars is painful and consequential. Losing big wars is highly consequential. The West is losing, and it is losing very badly. That will change many things. It's probably going to terminate NATO. NATO might hang around like the League of Nations until some other entity arises, but it will be non-functional, or rather, it will be more non-functional than it is now. Other consequences are possible. I think it's really best to understand that. It's sad, of course, it didn't have to be this way, but that's where we are. In the 30-plus years since the end of the Cold War, the West has fought many stupid wars, many of them as demonstrations of domestic political theater more so than strategic actions. Most of them were unwinnable and strategically retrograde. They created more of the thing they were supposedly fighting against. But this one is the stupidest one. It's the most strategically retrograde. So let us hope that it terminates the people, the institutions, and the worldview that gave rise to it. Those are the big implications of the war. They relate rather to the political, to the strategic, and indeed, one might say even to the civilizational aspects of global affairs today. I was asked, though, to speak of its impact on modern warfare, however, which is rather more narrow and more technical subject. So in the rest of the talk, if you're not provoked enough, I'll just talk about tactics, or mostly about tactics. I propose 8 separate lessons in what I would call strategic realism, which we may draw from the conflict so far. The first is probably the most important, and that is that industrial capacity still wins wars. Tweets don't produce artillery shells. Likes don't keep your supply lines running. This is a real problem for post-industrial states. It is, moreover, a particular problem for post-industrial states, which are also governed by post-national elites. It turns out that knowledge economies are very brittle. They have very, very low war-making potential relative to what other potential they may have. The numbers are really instructive. Russia is outproducing the entire West in artillery shells today by about 3-1. The situation was worse a few years ago, 2 years ago. After an extraordinary effort, we have managed to accelerate our own artillery shell production by a few percentage points. Likewise, armored vehicles, missiles, drones particularly, and much else besides that. On the basis of its old Soviet war machines, war forges, Russia is managing to outproduce a collective economy which is many times greater than it, because it still possesses industrial potential and other significant strengths which are not obvious, or which are perhaps not immediately obvious. It's achieved this, moreover, without defaulting on its debt or torching its domestic economy. Russia's war industrial economy is effective. The West, by contrast, is in big trouble. This is no surprise to you living in the West, if you are paying much attention. European industry particularly is on life support. There is no other way to put it. It's crushed by suicidal energy policies, amongst other things. The sanctions regime, which was meant to cripple Russia, has turned round and crippled the European industrial economy. Moreover, it turns out that the vaunted qualitative advantage of Western arms has been something of a mirage, as it was for the Germans 85 years ago as well. A lot of Western weapons are not all that good. They may be a little bit better, in some cases they are a little bit better, but very often they are not much better, but they are much more expensive. Moreover, if we think geostrategically, geoeconomically, it's astonishing to look at the simple fact that the war has propelled into being an alliance between the world's largest resource economy and the world's largest industrial economy. This strategic compact between Russia and China is a very big deal in historical terms. If we were to rank historically significant geoeconomic, geostrategic moments in order, I think it might be near the top for the last few centuries. It is essentially the thing which Sir Halford Mackinder, who invented geostrategy, geopolitics, over 100 years ago, was warning against. He invented a whole discipline of geopolitics to say, don't let Russia and China form a strategic compact. It's really very, very consequential. Recently, I went to Uzbekistan, very interesting place. And I went to the birthplace of Tamerlane, where Tamerlane was an enormously powerful military leader. He built a palace called Aksaray at his birthplace, which is still actually magnificent, though it is in a terrible state of ruin now. But it was gigantic for its day. The important thing as I looked at Tamerlane's palace was to realize that 500 years ago, standing there, you were at the center of the earth, financially speaking. There was a money stream going. The reason that Tamerlane was so powerful was not just that he was an enormously capable military leader, highly ruthless, very effective, and had a really good army, but because the global economy had its jugular vein running through the territory that he controlled. 2 generations later, that palace was in ruins. Tamerlane's descendants were paupers. Uzbekistan became the backwater, which to some degree it remains today, though perhaps not permanently. What happened to Tamerlane was not that he was defeated in battle, it was that the money stream moved into the ocean when the European powers figured out how to navigate from one place to another over global distances. And that money stream moved away, and that tore the guts out of the strategic enterprise, which was, up to that point, the most powerful place in person on earth. I think people should make some kind of pilgrimage to Aksaray, I think leaders should make a kind of pilgrimage to Aksaray to ponder the how quickly things can change and what really matters. And what really matters more often than not is where the money stream is. Okay, second point, mass matters. Precision only works when you have enough of it to make a difference. Without mass, even the most exquisite strike becomes a gesture. For that matter, technology effects only work if the other side is unable to reply effectively in kind, either with its own comparable technology or with some other tactical or strategic gambit, which does not necessarily have to be technological itself. Much ultimately, again, comes down to economy, not just who can hit precisely, but who can keep hitting as well as take hits. Here's the problem. Since the early 1990s, in fact, since the early 1980s and ideas going back into the mid-1970s, the West has placed all its eggs in one basket, which we might label high tech. That was what underpinned the offset strategies of the latter part of the Cold War. It was what made the 1980s air-land battle doctrine formidable. It was the basic idea behind the 1990s era infatuation with the so-called revolution in military affairs, which was supposed to make wars fast, easy, and cheap. But the technologies involved are no longer beyond the capabilities of many enemy players, which have increasingly successfully harnessed cheap digital technology to pre-existing mass or their remaining ability to generate mass on the basis of old assets, industrial assets. Perhaps the exemplary case in point, for me, of many that are possible, is the Russian FAB, or fuel-air bomb system, which has taken what is practically an inexhaustible supply of 50-year-old Soviet-era conventional bombs, bolted guidance and flight modules to them, and produced a precision strike system that is actually phenomenally cheap and which operates off of, as I said, 50-year-old bombs being launched by 60-year-old Tupolevs and hitting with the kinds of accuracy which we once believed was a unique property available only to the most well-financed and most technologically capable armed forces. Ursula von der Leyen's now famous remark about the Russian military having to cannibalize washing machines to keep itself going is one of the most stupid and hubristic remarks of strategic underestimation in military history. It's also, I think, going to be a very ironic remark to have made if indeed China decides that it will flex its rare earth metal monopoly on Europe, denying it the capability to produce high-end weapon systems until we can generate our own rare earth metals. That's at least a 10-year project. So who's going to be mining washing machines and breaking up old mobile phones in search of rare earth metals? Maybe Ursula von der Leyen. Third, soft power. Soft power is not eternal. The West's civilizational narrative fundamentally has lost its appeal. It no longer is attractive in the way it once was. There are lots of reasons for this. I won't go into them. I see a few people nodding away anyway. We can talk about it later. But suffice to say that, as polls would show, this is a true statement. There is a great diminishment in Western soft power. The war is supposed to have isolated Russia. It is supposed to have turned Russia into a pariah state. But it has not done so. The Arab world is quite happy to buy Russian weapons. In fact, throughout the Middle East, Russia is really quite popular. There was an astonishing event 18 months ago in which Saudi Arabia very, very deliberately signaled its willingness to work with Russia. Maybe Trump has brought Saudi back into the fold, but I'm not sure on that point. Indians are happy to buy Russian oil. The Chinese are pretty solid in their I'm not sure I would call it friendship, but their relationship with Russia, and recognize efforts to sever them from Russia as being self-defeating for them. Africa is quite open to Russian involvement with quite a significant presence throughout the continent. So who is isolated? The answer is Europe above all. What do the United States, Russia, and China all agree on? It's almost a rhetorical question because everybody knows. What they agree on is that Europe doesn't matter, which is a true statement. Josep Borrell, EU's former chief diplomat, famously described the world in this manner. He said, Europe is a garden, a place where everything works and everybody's more or less happy. Much of the rest of the world, by contrast, is the jungle. It seems as though the rest of the world noticed, however, that it was being patronized in this way, and they've had enough of it. For that matter, I wonder, had Borrell actually noticed the streets of Europe lately? The week before last was the 10-year anniversary of the Bataclan massacre. Western Europe is currently socially deeply unstable. There are a number of countries, including my own, which hover on the border of serious domestic turmoil, civil conflict, on a large scale. It is, and everybody knows this. If this is the garden, I wonder what kind of gardener this guy was. Fourthly, cyber warfare. Cyber warfare adds friction. It doesn't create transcendence from old strategic and military realities. I think a remarkable aspect of the current war, if you've been following the military and strategic literature of the last couple of decades, is how little cyber has figured into the conflict. As recently as 5 years ago, a British defense minister stood up in Parliament to defend the shutting down of infantry battalions in the British Army by saying that we were hiring more cyber warriors and that this would make things okay. That cyber would fill the gap produced by the lack of trained soldiers very, very admirably. The bottom line is that cyber has not turned out to be a substitute for steel whatsoever. Few phrases have garnered as much attention over the years as information war. The idea that success in war depends not on battlefield outcomes per se, but on dominating the information space. How much time do I have left?
You still have a lot of time. It's 10:07, so...
Okay. I got a lot of time?
Until 10:30.
Okay, I'm going to slow right down. No, I will carry on at the same pace, but I think I can get through everything I want to say. Ukraine, by all Western accounts, has won the information war hands down. Its strategic communications are savvier, its memes are spicier, and Zelensky's Churchillian pose has become a media staple. The man cannot appear at an international event without having the great and good fawn upon him very obviously. The reality, though, is that winning the narrative is not winning the war. These are not the same things. It may be helpful, yes, to win the narrative in terms of maintaining domestic support and maintaining international support, but it provides no shield against shrapnel. And moreover, its effects are not permanent, as we can see in the headlines of recent days concerning the 28-point peace proposal and the likelihood that this is likely to form the basis of negotiations, slow-speed negotiations, mind you. I imagine that the Russians will be perfectly able to talk about this for a year or 18 months or maybe 2 while events proceed on the ground. So fifthly, moving on, fifth lesson, shock and awe is no panacea. I know the term shock and awe went out of favor quite a while ago, but if it went out of use in that form, the basic idea has remained very, very popular in Western circles. Speed, we were told, kills. Speed kills. This is a very neat little formulation of an American general. You all remember Tommy Franks? Tommy Franks? It's the general in command of the invasion of Iraq in March, April 2003. And he wrote that line, speed kills. I gather it was a catchphrase of his, but it featured very largely in his memoir, American soldier, I remember, if I recall the title correctly. The gist of the idea is that victory belongs to the swift, and that war, therefore, needs to be conducted at pace, to use a popular British terminology. But once again, theory has collided with the reality. The Ukrainian summer offensive of 2023 foundered on deep Russian fortifications based upon 1940s era Soviet doctrine. In fact, it was earlier Soviet doctrine than that had been updated in the late 1940s for the atomic era. And Russia subsequently has been grinding the Ukrainian military down methodically. There was a great scene from the lead up to the summer 2023 offensive. It was just, I have a morbid fascination with fortifications and pillboxes and the like. And I saw a video which showed a Russian logistics column with 5 or 6 heavy trucks pulling concrete pillboxes on their load beds, off presumably. We can guess now where those pillboxes ended up. And because I'm an enthusiast of pillboxes, I recognize the design. It was the First World War design. And in fact, it wasn't just that these were First World War designed pillboxes. These were First World War pillboxes that were being picked up, presumably from, maybe a beach in Crimea or someplace where they'd been built 100 years ago, lifted up by a crane onto a truck and driven out to Zaporozhye or someplace like that, where they would be put back into use. There's a very good little phrase, popular with historians, sometimes called, invented by my colleague David Edgerton, called the shock of the old. The shock of the old. You've heard the phrase, the shock of the new. The shock of the old is a phrase brought up, created by David to explain the way in which elements of the past often come back in a kind of mutated form to form a kind of composite future that is much weirder than science fiction even would have imagined. The idea that First World War pillboxes rescued from a Crimean beach would be integrated into a 21st century fortified strategic complex, including a pervasive drone-based surveillance grid and fire control system is pretty weird, I think. But that's where we are. Moreover, I have to say also that Russian losses have been greatly exaggerated, often ludicrously so. The most reliable current estimate of Russian losses is Mediazona's, or done with the BBC, which at the beginning of this month was updated, and they estimated that Russia had taken 147,000 killed in action. You have to regard that as a ceiling, not a floor. That is the truth of the matter. Moreover, Russian recruitment ticks along at an average of 30,000 a month, sometimes spiking significantly higher. And that is without difficulty. Moreover, on top of that, I reiterate that the economy is in relatively good health. Disposable wealth is up by 48% since the start of the war. Unemployment is essentially zero. Inflation is high at 8%, but wage growth is at 22%. If you're anywhere in the Western world on a paycheck, You've not seen these kinds of numbers. Do you wonder why that Putin is relatively popular? Because people have butter and they have guns. 14% GDP, 14% is their debt to GDP ratio, which is several orders of magnitude better than even the best off Western economies. Maybe Luxembourg. Luxembourg is in good shape, presumably. But there's only 280,000 of the Luxembourgers, so don't rely on them. 7% of the Russian GDP is now being spent on defense, which is a lot, admittedly, but not all that much in Russian terms. Russian GDP, Russian defense expenditure usually runs between 4.5% to 5.5%. It reached a nadir in the 1990s when it was probably about 2% and maybe less. So 7% is high and probably higher than the Russian authorities would wish it to be, but it's not a crushing number. Where am I now? Sixthly, so I'm almost at the end, okay? Okay, maneuver. Maneuver has its limits. One of the most astonishing aspects of the war is the positional and static quality of it. The sweeping advances of the beginning of the war were soon replaced by attritional battles and by, above all, fortification. Fortifications of a scale and of a sophistication that is quite without precedent in modern times. It's a bit like, it's not my original analogy, but I quite like it, Verdun with drones. Western generals, for a while, pretended that they would have done it better. If they had been in that same situation, of course, they would have been able to maneuver their way to victory. The best example of this, I recall, was a discussion I had with a British general at the beginning of the war who had concluded that there wasn't much to learn in terms of lessons of the Russo-Ukraine war because effectively it was a war between two dinner ladies battering each other with lunch trays. I'm pretty sure he's changed his mind, or I certainly hope he's changed his mind. And that is to say that the war's static quality had to do with the poor quality of Russian and Ukrainian troops and generalship, which is not an argument that I feel could be sustained at this point in time. It certainly is not one that I would agree with. I don't think any such pretense is possible. In fact, I don't think any Western army is prepared in any way for the sort of war seen in Ukraine over the last 3 years. The speed and the responsiveness and the integration of reconnaissance and fire systems, the ability to maneuver and to infiltrate in groups of ones and twos, I don't think that any Western army now can keep up with that. They are a generation behind. One of the most interesting and little studied aspects of the war has been literally the underground conflict, in which we have seen a number of big Russian tactical advances achieved literally by tunneling, moving through pipelines, moving through sewer systems, and there is some indication also of, in fact, a quite intriguing aspect is the use of micro-tunneling or directional tunneling systems to connect up existing tunnel systems, tunnel networks. Historians of the future, I think, will wish to go and look at Russian military archives of this period to follow what Russian military intelligence is doing in old Soviet archives in Moscow. It turns out that the Soviet Union, as everyone knows, practically everyone knows, prepared very intensely for war. It tunneled a lot. It had a lot of underground complexes factories were built, not just with the normal suite of utility tunnels that come with factories, but with extra bunkers and a kind of, like, they were very over-engineered for their fortress potential. It turns out that the plans for all of these, because the Soviet Union was a highly centralized bureaucratic state, the plans for these sit in archives in Moscow. And Russian military intelligence officers are basically combing through old plans of factories, old urban planning documents, old geological and mining maps to look for where systems come close to each other and then connect them up with directional mining. That's pretty innovative, I think. It's literally underground. No one has seen it. We've gotten some hints of it on account of some publicized episodes. It isn't the first time that human beings have decided that the open air, that it's far too dangerous to have sky above you while trying to operate, and that decided to turn themselves into mole monsters, digging around the landscape. But it is a bit surprising, I think, in the 21st century that is occurring. Anyway, I think that's one aspect of the war which has not been covered very much. And I would be interested, after the war, as a student of these things, to learn more about it. Seventhly, digital dominance doesn't equal territorial control. You can't hold ground with hashtags. One of the craziest uses of information dominance is what I just described. You have information dominance in the form of access to otherwise unavailable information on the conformation of the subterranean aspects of the battle space. That is information dominance. It's perhaps not the way we become accustomed to thinking about information dominance, but it is the leveraging of an informational advantage. And then finally, I think, the political courage and will remain the decisive factors in warfare. Victory belongs not to the eloquent or to the agile, but to the side that can weather the storm. Putin remarked yesterday on the Trump's 28-point peace plan that Russia is happy to negotiate with Ukraine in one form or another, if that's what turns out, but they're equally happy to just let the thing play out on the ground. That, I think, is a reflection of a person who is prepared to weather the storm. Maybe he's like Odysseus lashing himself to the mast, but I think he's prepared, he's certainly publicly prepared to weather it. Of course, technology has altered the texture of warfare. It would be ridiculous of me to suggest that was not the case. And I absolutely am not trying to suggest that the texture of war or the character of war has not been altered by changes in technology which have delivered different sorts of weapons or have changed the way some weapons are used. My point, rather, is that the degree to which these things have benefited the West is much less than was expected. Technology has not offered a clean, clickable route to victory. We were told that the information age would flatten borders, that it would replace firepower with fiber optics, and would substitute narratives for armored divisions. Instead, we got trenches, mass mobilization, and an emerging Eurasian bloc with both industrial capacity and civilizational will. In the end, strategic success depends not on who reacts fastest or who trends the hardest, but on the dull, unglamorous verities that underlie modern war. And those are production, patience, and purpose. And I think I'll stop there. Yeah, I'll take some questions or your arrows or hand grenades if you like. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we will give the floor to the audience, but before, I wanted to ask one question. You said that, of course, industrial capacity is essential to win wars. Now it looks like the European Union, for instance, is, at least on the paper, understanding this. They put forward this plan, which is called Readiness 2030, in order to increase the industrial capacity of the European Union when it comes to the military industry. I wanted to know your take on this proposal. Do you think that this will be useful to attain the purpose that it is supposed to serve? Do you think that the proposal is solid, that it has the capacity to really get to increase the industrial base of the European Union in a way that is both quantitatively enough, no? And at the same time that it can be done at a reasonable price? Let's say that it can be cheap enough, no, to also achieve its goals. What is your take on this matter?
I wonder if, in answering this, I might step on the toes too much of the presentation this afternoon, because I think we are coming.
Actually, it is,
yeah. But so, for what it's worth, I'm highly skeptical of this. Very highly skeptical of this. Firstly, as I said, the reason that European industry is so in such trouble is because it's uneconomic. It's uneconomic because of its not just because of the regulatory regime, which is parasitic, but because of its energy generation, its whole energy infrastructure that makes things too expensive, too costly. I wonder, in the case of my own country, what are they going to build these weapons with? We don't have a steel industry anymore. We shipped that out. We have a few steel fabricators, but not with the capability to create large amounts of high-grade steel. As far as I'm aware, military weapons are still made out of high-grade steel for the most part. Right? You can't really... Germany is the industrial center of Europe. When the German industries are closing up because they can't operate, you should be... Anyways, suffice to say that I think both for regulatory and for energy reasons, I'm skeptical of the big European rearmament project. I think what we're likely to see is the upgrading of existing systems. So you'll see old main battle tanks, for example, get new electronics, take out old hulls, or rather take out old turrets and put new ones on top. So that sort of thing is possible. I don't see much potential on the part of defense industries. I talk a lot to people in defense industry, particularly in high-end things like missile systems, high-end radars. They don't have a lot of extra capacity, and it takes a long time to bring it online. 2030, no chance. Maybe, not I don't see it, in short.
Okay, and you also said that victory belongs to the side that can weather the storm. You know? And well, I think it's pretty evident that in the West, especially in Europe, and more specifically even in Western Europe, no, this willingness to weather the storm might be less than on the Russian side, for instance. Do you think that this issue, which relates rather to the mindset, no? Do you think that this can change? Do you think that there is a possibility that at some point public opinion will be more, and also the political leadership, will be more willing to assume costs when it comes to this confrontation? Or you think that this is a problem that it is unlikely to be solved?
Yeah, your observation is quite correct regarding the relative propensity to sacrifice and to fight. That's pretty well observed. There was two surveys done by Pew, the global survey firm. I forget which years it was. I think it was 2008 and then 2018 or something like that. You can easily find them because it was a Pew survey which asked in a range of countries, would you fight for your country? And the response was pretty astonishing. I think in Germany it was 13% answered positively. Maybe it was 11%, in fact. The UK was fairly high. If I remember correctly, the UK was 28. Russia was pretty high at 60. Ukraine was quite high at slightly middle 60s. Turkey high. Of course, this is a snapshot, right? Things change. And what I feel like fairly confident from just an amateur reading of history is that nothing stays the same, and so Europe at this point in its civilizational existence is rather comfortable, rather fat, rather stupid, and rather complacent. And the generation which is coming into which is coming up now, will have a lot of growing up to do. They will have to be much stronger, much more deliberate, much more serious people. They will have to be much more pragmatic. I hope that, and I think that's going to happen. I hope that doesn't happen after what happened to Russia in the 1990s happens to you, right? But that's a possibility, in all honesty, that Europe again will become pragmatic and capable and realistic, but only after it has suffered a huge economic and social setback that scares the bejesus out of them for a generation or two or three afterwards. So yes, things will change, but I don't think it's going to be a very pleasant change, and it will have, so that's it.
So change will come after pain. No? That's
change will come after pain, yes.
Well, now we will open the floor to the audience. I see a hand raising here. Do we have the microphone over there, or we...
Thank you very much. It was fascinating, Dr. There are three things that you said that make me get up. First, about you started talking about NATO and talking against the expansion to the east of NATO, and then you said that the war was something unnecessary. Arguably, it's the opposite. Ukraine has been invaded because it was not part of NATO, whereas Estonia and Latvia are, and would be a lot easier to invade, but they are part of NATO. And the invasion 3-4 years ago happened in the way it happened because in 2014, which is when they had this soft invasion, they realized that the United States was not willing to honor the agreements in Budapest. So it's the opposite. Because they were outside of that alliance system, and because that alliance system now is proving to be not as strong as it was, there is danger. You have to prepare for war if you want to avoid war, not the opposite. Second, you talked about the shock and awe. Certainly, it's a lesson from before the Second World War. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg. Essentially, at the beginning of a war, you want to go fast because that's when you can do it. After that, then it blocks. Happened in the Second World War. It happened even more in the First World War. You remember that the big movements happened at the beginning of the First World War, except in the East, where the front was much wider and therefore it wasn't fortified. So actually, the lesson, it's known that you want shock and awe at the beginning, and sure enough, the United States has got used to using shock and awe frequently because they could win the wars just like that. But the lesson that after a while the front blocks and all fortifications work is known. The third thing that got me a bit uncomfortable was your estimate of the Russian losses. Because you mentioned something like 150,000, you said, and that was kind of the top. You said 146,000. Most of the war has been the Russia attacking and the Ukrainians defending. Most of it has been. There was a period most of it, and against heavy defenses. Statistically, you know that typically it's estimated that the attacking force will lose 3 people for every person that the defending force loses. It's a standard. And the Russians will not invent something new on that, particularly knowing the way they are attacking, which is reminiscent of the First World War. It's like men being killed and then followed by. So the statistics cannot be any better than that. What you're saying is 150,000 being tops means that Ukraine would have lost 50,000 at tops. I mean, that doesn't make sense. We know that it's more. So I think that statistic is grossly underestimated simply because of logic. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm not sure I could take all three. I mean, you said that some of these things made you uncomfortable, and I don't really have a response to that per se. So let me just pick up on the third one. The media's on a calculation done with BBC is on obituaries, grave counting, and basically public information available in Russia. So it is from a methodological point of view the most sound. As far as the 3-to-1, I don't think that's true. I can think off the top of my head of a dozen offensives where the casualties to the attacker were very much less than those of the defender. That argument is, I hear it often. I don't know how it entered into the kind of the lexicon of strategy, but fundamentally it's untrue. If it was untrue, then the Persian Gulf War of 1990 would have required another the United States lost more guys in traffic accidents, if I recall correctly, than they did in combat in that battle. In terms of casualties, if it was less than 100-to-1, I would be surprised. Likewise, the German invasion of France. Likewise, in fact, the Soviet reconquest, of large parts of Eastern Europe at the end of the war, you cease to see this 3-to-1 effect. So I wouldn't use that as a predictor. I didn't mention Ukrainian casualties. except there are perfectly good, there is reasonably good information on Ukrainian casualties as well. As it turns out, my wife's family is Ukrainian, so I'm pretty sensitive to this fact, or let me not call it a fact, sensitive to this bit of disputed information, but Ukrainian casualties are many orders of magnitude greater than those of Russia's. And that comes down to, I think that comes down fundamentally to the artillery preponderance.
There's one aspect of Russian losses that no one talks about. Putin is a strong proponent, along with China, of what he calls the wolf warrior doctrine. And under the wolf warrior doctrine, your forward troops are the most expendable. And if you noticed, early in the war, he recruited mostly misfits. They made a big play in the West because they didn't understand it, of Tupolovs full of, street people being lined up and sent in. Guys who were sentenced to jail being lined up. All kinds of undesirables. They were the ones who suffered the greatest losses in the first attacks. Putin wanted to get rid of them. He's written about how am I going to get all these people off my hands. So I think he was happy to see them go.
I think that's, I think that's a very good observation. There's an idea that is quite common that essentially goes that Russia is indifferent to casualties. And the reality is that Russia, and particularly this regime, is quite casualty sensitive, and they have been since the first Chechen war. There was an extraordinary scene during the first Chechen war in which a group of Russian mothers that were part of a social movement called the Mothers of Soldiers Committee. This group of moms hired a bus and drove to Chechnya and went onto the battlefield where the sons of some of the women in the group were serving. They walked into this active combat. A woman with a television crew behind her took her son by the ear and pulled him out of the battle. And the camera is on, you can see this on YouTube if you want. The camera is on the completely astonished Russian company commander, an army major, who is trying to make sense of this situation. And forgive me if I use the vulgarity, but it's in. She said, how does she put it? If you think you're keeping my fucking son here, you've got another fucking thing coming to you. She put her son on the bus, and they drove back to Russia. Okay, it's the most extraordinary scene that I've ever encountered of a deeply unpopular war and a population which is not casualty insensitive. They're very sensitive to conscript casualties. But I think you're exactly right too. These, a guy with the triple stars on his shoulder, some guy out of a gulag and a rap sheet of murder and drug. They could care less. They would if they could, they'd strap a bomb to him, and these. So it's as many things. It's complicated. If Russia was using conscripts in Ukraine right now, I think it would be a very different story, and that would be a very highly sensitive, very difficult thing for Putin to do, to deploy conscripts there, because I don't think the Russian public would put up with it. Or they have the Russian people like Putin and those around him and people at high levels in the military understand that actually the Russian public does not want to see their sons' lives thrown away. Though they may think otherwise about, like Wagner mercenaries and sledgehammer maniacs, whatever. You can throw as many of those into the ditch as you want.
Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. Truly interesting. I would like you to comment, if you might, on a couple of also recent facts or trends that have surfaced in Western media, and considering your take on what Western media has been saying, it might be interesting to hear points. The first is on the change between, or the waving change. It's happened before, but it's happening now, where Russia seems to intensify a bombing campaign across Ukraine, also in Western Ukraine. I don't know if at the expense of, but at least in conjunction with the trench warfare. I'm not sure whether that is signaling anything strategically from their point of view, or they're thinking on the timing of the peace negotiations, if anything. So that's the first. And the second is that there's also been media reports on the international recruits of Russia. There's been an effort by Ukrainian journalists on going to prisons where they are now, the POWs, and hearing their stories right from Kenya, from China, from anywhere. I wonder whether that is part of Russia's global stance, whether that is something that's, first of all, militarily significant. I don't think so, but maybe it is. And second, geopolitically or sort of that is projecting willingly or not, in a sense. Thanks.
Well, I'll take the second question first about the foreigners fighting on the Russian side. I think that's very, very interesting, but I'm a bit skeptical that this is a very large phenomenon, with one important exception. I've noticed, for example, there's an American guy who has been in the Russian, who's appeared in Russian media. He made a very deliberate move of his family from America to Russia, and has been serving in, I think, in a logistic capacity, probably fixing trucks or something, like changing tires or something like that. And he's clearly, I think, being deployed in terms of his informational effect, which is why I've seen him on the television 15 or 20 times. There's there's been a regular series of, appearances of guys from Africa, Kenyans or what have you. Again, I think these are pretty obviously put forward by the Russian military media as it is unusual. And a Japanese guy, or at least, two Japanese guys I've noticed so far. But anyway, I don't think that the Japanese or the Kenyans or the Americans are lining up to fill up the Russian Foreign Legions. But there are some, and good propagandic use is being made out of them, more or less. The exception is the North Koreans, and I don't know enough about that. There's a lot but one of the things which perversely makes me think that this is a bigger deal than you might expect is that there is more operational security about it. Sometimes, all war is deception, right? So when your enemy, you have your enemy is if you're not lying to your enemy, then you're doing it wrong, and you have to just assume that your enemy is lying to you. And sometimes when the kind of information flow gets a bit restricted, I think it's I personally would tend to conclude that maybe there's more going on there. So I think the North Korean thing is probably a bigger deal than I thought when it first was announced that there were some there. The numbers are possibly significant: 5,000, 10,000, 15. I'm not sure, and they seem to have had some significant local tactical effect. But in general, I don't think it's. So that's what I would say about the foreign fighter aspect. The change in targeting is interesting too. I'd observed this. One of the things that I'd observed in the first couple of years of the war is that Russia was quite obviously deliberately avoiding hitting stuff that would be very expensive to rebuild. So thermal power plants, like big, important pieces of infrastructure, and bridges. Which is perplexing, because from the point of view of using violence, basically, classic definition of violence in war is the causing of pain and the destruction of value. So you would normally hit those sorts of things because that's pretty freaking painful when your power plants get blown away and your bridges get destroyed. Bridges, of course, are also extremely important as for their logistic potential, which is very important in this particular war because of the geography of the region, which has these big, long, otherwise very difficult to cross rivers. So you would have expected, all things being equal, that Russia would be plastering bridges and wiping out energy infrastructure and so on. But instead it was doing these micro attacks on transformer stations and things like that, which are quite cheap comparatively. And I can only surmise what I surmised from that was that they're cheap, basically. I mean, the Russians are cheap. They were looking ahead to the post-war condition and saying, well, we don't want to break all this stuff and then have to rebuild it, right? So it's kind of subtle declaration of intent about where they see the post-war borders. So the change recently with the attacks on power plants and the attacks on bridges, I think might, this is just my guess, but might represent an alteration of Russian thinking about their potential to realize the full ambition with respect to how much of Ukraine they can take. Because they're obviously willing to break stuff now that they weren't willing to break before, which says to me that they don't intend to take those things. And they're happy to pass the costs actually on to the Ukrainians, which means effectively to you, because the Ukrainians are not going to be able to pay for it. That's my guess, as far as it can go.
Thanks. First of all, thanks for your presentation. It has been very interesting. You have said that Russia is crippling Ukraine, and I wonder crippling
yes.
Ukraine, and I wonder to what extent this is really true, because I think that we are undermining what Ukraine has achieved. You have also talked about shock and awe. That was Russia's strategy, in my opinion, in the first days of the war, conquering Kyiv in 3 days. And
they didn't say that.
All right, but that's what the narrative established in the first days.
Yeah, but that wasn't Russian narrative.
It was our narrative, but still, that was the narrative that was present in those days. And right now, nobody, at least in my opinion, debates that Kyiv is going to fall, at least in Russian hands. The front has been established in the Donbass. It reminds me also of the Spanish Civil War with the Aragon Front, in fact. So my question is, aren't we undermining what Ukraine has achieved? Russia has been using nowadays motorcycles to carry their troops to the territories. They have been using pickups with machine guns instead of like military trucks. So that's my question.
Okay. The fact that they're using motorcycles to move troops and pickups or what have you to move troops is not necessarily a reflection of what I think you're suggesting it might mean. I think it's probably that is the appropriate tactical adaptation to an environment where in order to survive, you have essentially two possible modes of existence. One is moving very quickly in small numbers or under hard cover. So I don't see that in that case being on a motorcycle is really necessarily indicative of military exhaustion, and rather instead indicative of an appropriate and necessary tactical adaptation to the current state of observation and lethality on the battlefield.
You have compared the Ukrainian war to the First World War. I was wondering if you see it ending in much of the same way, with societal collapse of either party, at this point probably Ukraine, leading to a cease of military activities instead of, for example, the Second World War, which ended with a total military defeat.
Yeah, I like the comparison to the First World War in preference to the Second or other wars, because I think that one of the distinctive things about the First World War historically is the consequence, is how it changed the whole arrangement of European diplomatic affairs or European political affairs. So you had the collapse of the European empires, and you also had essentially the termination of the European ideal of the modern project. Now, it wasn't obvious to everyone that the modern project, as idealized by Europeans from the late 18th century through to the early 20th, had been slain on the battlefields of the First World War. But it was very obvious to poets and artists and the like, which is why after the First World War you get T.S. Eliot writing The Wasteland, or Yeats writing his famously depressed poem about the Second Coming, right? So the First World War is important as this kind of watershed event. And I think that the current war is like that. I think that it is where I was talking earlier about Europe now having to essentially to grow up very, very quickly again, is representative of the kind of having come to this kind of oh shit moment where everything has fallen apart. And in short, that's why I've made that comparison. No comparison. I don't want to draw it too much. In many ways, it's a much smaller war. It is a big war, of course, but it is even as big as this one is. It's still a fraction of the size of the First World War. But in terms of its consequences in the long term, I think it's on that scale.
Okay, so if there are no more requests, I think that we can leave it here. This has been extremely insightful. Thank you very much. And actually, you have raised some topics that will be addressed later by the other speakers. You already mentioned that actually the issue of the industrial capacity will be addressed. And also, the next speaker will address one of the issues that you also raised, which is that, as you said, that Mackinder already warned against the emergence of a strategic compact between Russia and China. So this will be actually the topic, the next topic that will be addressed in the second conference, the emergence of the Russian bear, of this strategic coordination between Russia and China. This will be the topic, but before we will have the coffee break, and so we will have this break, and it was the next conference will begin, I think, if I'm not wrong, at 11:40, right? Or 11:50. Okay. So thank you very much for your attention, and see you right back.